วัสดีค่ะผู้รับชมทุกท่านยินดีต้อนรับเข้าสู่การประชุมวิชาการวัคซีนแห่งชาติครั้งที่ 10 ดิฉันนางสาวสุภัสสุตาด้วงรักษารับหน้าที่เป็นพิธีกรสำหรับช่วงนี้ค่ะสำหรับการบรรยายในช่วงนี้จะเป็นการบรรยายในภาคภาษาอังกฤษในลำดับถัดไปดิฉันจึงขออนุญาตดำเนินรายการเป็นภาษาอังกฤษค่ะ Distinguished guests, speakers, participants สวัสดีค่ะ Welcome to the first day of the 10th National Vaccine Conference. Our theme for the conference is Vaccines, Tool for Sustainable Prevention and Control of Emerging Infectious Diseases. My name is Supasuta Dongraksa. On behalf of National Vaccine Institute, I am going to be your MC during this plenary, which is such an honor to be here and to meet you all. For our plenary today, we have 3 keynote speakers who are experts in the field of global preparedness on emerging infectious diseases in terms of epidemics and vaccine development. They are all from well-known international organizations as World Health Organization, known as WHO, Coalition for Epidemics Preparedness Innovations, known as CEPIS, and International Vaccine Institute, known as IVI. For audiences online, you can participate our event by submitting questions or suggestions through our chat box, and we will collect the questions to ask our speakers during a 20-minute Q&A session after all the presentation ended. Now, please welcome Dr. Supamichun Sutiwat as he will be the moderator for this plenary. Dr. Supamit is an advisor to the Department of Disease Control, Ministry of Public Health of Thailand. He advises on the control of communicable disease with emphasis on immunization and emerging infectious diseases. For National Immunization Program, he had a leading role in the introduction of several new vaccines in the past decade. Currently, he is a member of Thailand National Vaccine Committee that drives policy for national capacity in vaccine. He has served the WHO in several capacities, including a member of SAGE, Influenza Preparedness and Response Working Group, Southeast Asia Regional Certification Commission for Poliomyelitis Eradication, and the WHO Technical Advisory Group on COVID-19 vaccine composition. Again, please welcome Dr. Supamichun Sutiwat Ka.
สวัสดีครับ Good morning. Dear Professor Piyasakon, Minister of Public Health, Dr. Nakorn Premsi, the Director of the National Vaccine Institute, distinguished participants, it's my great honor to join this national conference and to serve as the moderator for this session. As the MC suggested, this conference is the 10th of its kind, and this one is of special character, as the earlier 9 national conferences were conducted in the conventional on-site fashion and with the participation of the audience in person. But this time, the conference is carried out totally online due to the COVID situation. However, this offers us some blessing in disguise. The online mode facilitates participation of many international speakers, which was less feasible earlier. So today we have the privilege of the participation and contribution of 3 renowned authorities and experts in vaccine. Dr.Jos Vandelaer of WHO, Dr.Melanie Saville of CEPI, and Dr.Jerome Kim of IVI, to share with us their views and experiences regarding global preparedness on emerging infectious diseases, with special regard on vaccine development. And I'm going to introduce them in more detail shortly. Distinguished participants, in the past 2 years, we've been living under the influence of COVID-19 pandemic, and it is quite clear that we'll continue to be living with it for some more time. Even though some people are expecting or even praying for the pandemic to quickly turn into an endemic disease of some sort as soon as possible, so that we can resume our normal life and our economy and well-being. However, this session, we will try to take a broader orientation going beyond COVID-19 to a larger scope of emerging infectious diseases, some of which may turn into pandemic at certain times. Before we hear from our speakers, please allow me a few minutes to recall our memories of some emerging infectious diseases. Looking back, essentially in the past 2 decades, the world has experienced the threats and impacts of several emerging infectious diseases. In 2003, we saw the emergence of SARS, starting from Hong Kong and going around the world in half a year. This sounds like the movie 80 Days Around the World. In 2004, we faced with the emergence of a highly pathogenic influenza, avian influenza H5N1, starting from southern China and sweeping westward along the migratory bird flyways to the whole of Asia, to North Africa and many parts of Europe. In 2009, the world experienced a real pandemic influenza caused by a novel influenza virus H1N1. But fortunately, this pandemic was less severe than the previous ones in the past centuries. And since 2012, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, caused by a coronavirus popped up in Saudi Arabia and later spread to many Middle East countries with occasional spillovers to countries in other regions. And most recently, we were thrilled by the emergence of new coronavirus, or SARS-CoV-2, in the city of Wuhan, China, in January 2020. The epidemic in China quickly expanded into a pandemic in a few months. And after 2 years, we've gone through 4 waves of COVID-19 caused by new variants. From the original Wuhan to Alpha to Delta, and most recently to Omicron strains, which will not be the last. A main tool in public health repertoire to cope with COVID-19 and many other emerging infectious diseases is certainly vaccine. In the past 2 years, the response to COVID-19 pandemic, we are witnessing phenomenal speed of scientific development, clinical testing, approval for use, manufacture, and deployment of COVID-19 vaccines. This level of acceleration wasn't seen in the past, not even dreamed of. Our invited speakers represent international organizations that are among key players and drivers of these challenging developments. Now I will seek views of our distinguished speaker to address global preparedness for emerging infectious diseases with the main focus on vaccine development. Let me first call upon Dr.Jos Vandelaer, the World Health Organization representative to Thailand. Dr. Vandelaer has taken up the office in Thailand last October. A year prior to his current position, he was the Regional Director of Emergencies in the World Health Organization Regional Office of Southeast Asia. Before working with WHO Regional Office, he was the WHO representative to Nepal. And earlier, he was the chief of UNICEF's Global Immunization Program. After having held immunization-related positions at the World Health Organization in the Philippines, India, and Myanmar, he started his career with Medicine Sans Frontiers, working in emergencies in Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Suriname, and Thailand. And later he worked in immigration refugee health for the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, in Vietnam and Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and for the UNHCR in Myanmar. Actually, Dr. Vandelaer planned to join this conference in person. However, recently he found out that he would have to be present at the meeting of the WHO regional office in Delhi on this same date. So he has kindly prepared a video presentation for us of what he wants to share with us. Now let's attend to Dr. Vandelaer's talk.
Dear Chairperson, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, Sawadee Krap. My name is Jos Vandelaer and I'm the WHO representative to Thailand. And it's a pleasure to be here and being invited to speak at this plenary meeting that talks about the global preparedness on emerging diseases, particularly on the epidemic side of things and the vaccine development. And I've been asked to say a few things around successes and challenges related to the R&D blueprint for COVID-19. When we talk about COVID, of course, we think about the pandemic, about all the problems that this pandemic has caused. But we sometimes also forget some of the successes. And the successes are related to the research and development and implementation of the results of that development. So I want to thank all the people in the research and development world who have come up with quite a number of improvements in a very short time frame, and also to all the colleagues who have taken these developments on and turned them into real-world solutions to address the pandemic. So, if we talk about the R&D blueprint, basically it started in 2015 when the World Health Assembly asked or called for an R&D blueprint for action to prevent epidemics, as they called it. So this is way before the COVID pandemic hit. And the idea was to create a blueprint that would help us with the coordination between researchers and public health officials. Second, to accelerate all the R&D processes. And third, to come up with new norms and standards by learning from a global response. And as you can see from these aims, these were very, very pertinent once we started having COVID-19. Then, a little bit after that, a scientific group was brought together and they were asked to prioritize which diseases should be the subject for this R&D blueprint. And they came up with, and they were asked actually to come up with fewer than 10 diseases. Marburg fever, Lassa fever, Ebola, and so on were among these two. And then very interesting, in 2018, so this group actually met on an annual basis and to kind of update the list and see what the progress had been. And in 2018, interestingly enough, they added a new disease called Disease X, which was kind of a way of saying we need to think about an unknown pathogen, something that may happen that we can't think about now. And this was, of course, a foresight for what would happen a year later, in late 2019, when COVID emerged. And by including this disease X into the list, they actually challenged WHO to become more flexible in its planning and its capabilities. They challenge WHO to be more open-minded and not just think around diseases that were known entities, but also start to think about mechanisms on how to drive R&D and implementation for a disease that wasn't well known yet and therefore for which we didn't know how it would behave. Then fast forward to 2020 when COVID was declared a public health emergency of international concern. The R&D blueprint was activated to actually address the issues that have come up with COVID. And a roadmap was drawn up that set out the goals and objectives and the priorities that needed to be addressed. And as goals, two things were kind of summarized in this document. First was the acceleration of innovative research to help contain the spread of COVID. And secondly, contribute to a global research platform. In other words, learn from what's going on now with COVID so that later on we're better prepared. So both in terms of containing the spread and also in terms of learning for the future. The blueprint, this is a schematic representation for the blueprint set in terms of the roadmap for R&D. Of course, if you start asking people to work on R&D, you have a number of national R&D partners and a number of R&D plans that all start working on COVID-related issues. And what was important to hear is that there was a coordination mechanism over and above all these initiatives, that the whole thing was coordinated and that it wasn't all people working in their own corners doing duplicative work or leaving huge gaps. So coordination was very, very important. What was also very important was to bring already from the beginning the developers and the manufacturers on board. If we're talking about vaccines or we're talking about therapeutics or diagnostics, it's important to bring the people who are actually going to produce it on board so that whatever you are researching actually can make it into the field at some point. Funding was of course another important thing, and the funding aligned with these priorities that were being set and these activities that were being put forward was very, very important. And then finally, it was also important that once you started having a product, you needed to have a harmonized plan for the scaling up of manufacturing. It's not enough to just have a vaccine if you can't produce this vaccine at mass scale. So you needed harmonized plans so that scaled up capacity, manufacturing capacity was possible. And if we look at how this actually played out in the real world, what this graph shows you, or this slide shows you rather, is where all this happened. And what you see is that basically this was a global was and is a global effort, bringing in numerous different partners into the whole picture. So the R&D blueprint brings together all these partners under one umbrella to work in their own fields, but in the same direction of containing the spread of the virus and at the same time learning from what we're doing for the future. And not only everywhere in the world, but also a multidisciplinary network was established with more than 1,000 institutions from 3,000 researchers, 134 countries. All kinds of disciplines are being brought in under this whole umbrella of the R&D blueprint and the global roadmap. And although this is a number of streams are being worked on, therapeutics, vaccines, clinical research, epidemiology, and so on, by a number of partners in each of these fields, yet there is a structure in it. It is flexible because in some fields will become bigger, new partners will come on board, other partners may drop out, but it's a structured architecture where basically the different groups are working in a way that helps them produce results in collaboration with colleagues in their own fields and in their other fields. And here are a few examples of what has been achieved and what this meant in terms of implications. And I won't go through the whole list, but for example, the research around virus characteristics has led to diagnostic tests. When we started understanding better the epidemiology of the virus, it helped us to design public health and social measures. Clinical aspects helped us to understand that oxygen worked and that corticosteroids worked, etc. So of course, the list is quite long, as you can see, and is certainly not complete. But it is simply to say that there were direct results from this research in various fields, and we are now used to having vaccines and drugs and masks, etc. for this pandemic. But 2 years ago, we did not know whether masks worked. We did not know what to do when a patient felt sick. We did not know how to even get vaccines. This has all happened in the last 2 years. This all understanding is based on research, not just in one field or in two fields, but in a whole array of fields. And of course, also, we shouldn't forget that this may be not so much research, but a lot of work has also gone on around regulatory science, that the emergency use for vaccines and therapeutics, having a special procedure to allow that is, for example, one of the outcomes. But also the work on infodemics and on an M&E framework has also been very important. So my last slide here is maybe if we look at all this work that has happened, the lessons learned. A few lessons here come up, and certainly there are more than this, but I just wanted to highlight a few which probably then also will come up in the discussions later on. First of all, the contributions of all areas of research. It's not just vaccines or not just epidemiology. It's a lot of areas of research, including, for example, in social areas, that has been important to address this epidemic or this pandemic. The existence of research networks, groups of institutions working together so that we have a consolidated and coordinated approach. Contributions from both the private sector and the public sector. Both of them have played a role and are playing a role, and as well as multi-sectoral approaches, as I showed in the previous slide. Governments have stepped up very often with funding, which was crucial to get the research going. And in funding this research, it has been important to think end to end. Not just a part of the research, but think through around, if we start this result, we need to fund it all the way through an end product that we can then use in the field. End-to-end alignment of donors and priorities with this research has been very important. We've also seen that an approach that is based on the epidemiology of the disease has been important, and the country ownership in all that also. Understanding what the disease actually is, how the virus behaves, how it transmits, where do we see more cases and why, has been crucial to understand the virus, has been crucial to understand the disease dynamics, but also has been crucial to drive the R&D priorities. And then also large trial platforms as part of the response. In other words, trials have been set up to take place at the same time before actually the final product was maybe ready to be trialed. So rather than small trials one after the other, there have been large trials at the same time, and having same platforms so that these results could be compared, so that you have many more data early on, and that you can then bring the products to the market much easier. Not everything has been good, of course. We are seeing impact being hampered by lack of scaling up capacity. Initially, and particularly on the vaccine side, is a classic example. But we've also seen nationalism, particularly again with the vaccines, leading to inequities, issues around intellectual property rights, where there is still resistance to share certain patents or certain intellectual property so that the productions can be scaled up. The whole issue of infodemics, fake news going around and people making decisions, for example, again, around not being vaccinated or not adhering to basic rules, has been an issue. And then of course also the economic fallout, which maybe initially wasn't really on people's radar. These are maybe areas where research in the future can play a bigger role, so that we are ahead of the curve, that we think about these things before we start developing new methods, new technologies, and new ways of addressing an epidemic or a pandemic. I think in summary, the R&D blueprint, which was set up before the COVID pandemic hit, has proven to be a mechanism that has allowed to coordinate and to drive a huge research agenda over a number of fields in a coordinated way, and has streamlined all this, leading to very quick results and very quick solutions that can be brought to the benefit of all of us, and are still being developed as we speak. So if we are today in a world 2 years into the pandemic, where we do have vaccines that work, where we do know that masks work, where we have diagnostics, it is thanks to the work of thousands of colleagues who have worked in their own area, but have worked with colleagues in doing so, and in a coordinated way. Thank you again for inviting me, and I wish you a good meeting. Sawadee krap.
Very informative and very clear presentation. Dr. Vandelaer explained for us the role of WHO as the core partner in raising global preparedness for emerging infectious diseases. WHO works with the governments, vaccine developers, manufacturers, funders, regulators, and relevant international partners on vaccine development for emerging infectious diseases under the framework of the so-called R&D blueprint for action to prevent epidemics. It's been declared since 2015. This blueprint lays roadmap and guidance for coordination with researchers, scientists, and for the acceleration of the R&D process and development of new norms and standards. He also told us that a disease X has been added to the blueprint to represent the so-called unknowable unknown pathogen as a target for challenging exercise of the blueprint. The blueprint was put to test in real-world response to COVID-19 pandemic very recently, and WHO plays the role of core coordinator to bring together the extensive range of partners, including CEPI, Gavi, EU, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the NDI, and many governments to mount collaboration for COVID-19 vaccine R&D, manufacture, and approval for emergency use. All of this with record-breaking speed. Many lessons are learned about key success factors and main gaps. Lessons learned will be applied, and capacities built will be maximized to further implement the blueprint to address vast emerging infectious diseases. He reiterated the value of strong cooperation, working together across all levels of partners to achieve the goal, the common goal of global security. I believe at this point, our audience may have some questions and answers, questions and comments to share with. I suggest we hold questions and comments until we finish with the presentations of 3 speakers. And I'm sure we'll have enough time to entertain the questions and comments. And in the meantime, please, if you have any questions and comments, please post them in the chat box and we will put them up for discussion. Now let's move on. The second speaker is Dr. Melanie Saville. Dr. Saville is Executive Director of Vaccine Research and Development, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI. CEPI may be new to many of us. CEPI was launched in 2017 as an innovative international partnership between public, private, philanthropic, and civil organizations to develop vaccines against future epidemics. Dr. Saville leads the technical teams supporting vaccine development and enabling science projects funded by CEPI, and is the research and development and manufacturing workstream leader for COVAX, which is the global collaboration for speeding up development, manufacture, and equitable distribution of new vaccines. Many countries signed on the COVAX to get guaranteed access to COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Saville is a physician specialized in virology with 20 years of experience in development and licensure of vaccines for the developed and developing world. She has contributed to the development and licensure of several vaccines for seasonal and pandemic influenza, pediatric combinations, rabies, Japanese encephalitis, dengue, and Ebola vaccine. And like Dr. Vandelaer, Dr. Saville has to shift her live talk on this panel to a recorded version due to her immediate missions. I will now ask our secretariat to share with you the video presentation for Dr. Saville on the role and experiences of CEPI.
Hello, my name's Melanie Saville, and I'm Executive Director of Vaccines Research and Development at CEPI. And what I will be talking to you today about is preparing for future pandemics and the role of vaccine R&D. I'll be using many examples of CEPI's experiences through the pandemic to look to the future as what work needs to be done in addition. So just as a way of introduction, CEPI is an organization that was set up following the Ebola crisis in West Africa, with a mission to accelerate the development of vaccines against emerging infectious diseases and enable access of those vaccines to the populations who most need them. We work with countries, with public and private sector to accelerate the vaccines that are being developed. And this next slide shows you the trajectory of activities that CEPI has partaken in the last 5 years, as well as looking into the future for further pandemic preparedness. So as we were set up in 2017, we really had 3 key objectives: developing vaccines against priority pathogens, developing rapid response platforms that could be used in epidemics and in pandemics, but also not just looking at the vaccines themselves, but also looking at what the enabling science activities, whether that's standards, assays, preclinical models, epidemiology, were needed to really support that accelerated vaccine development. And obviously, as COVID-19 hit in 2020, we pivoted towards vaccine development for COVID-19, really building on the experience that we had in the pre-pandemic time to accelerate vaccine development. As we move through the pandemic, seeing the need to develop more broadly protective approaches and really looking at an end-to-end approach. And as we're moving into what we call CEPI 2.0, the next 5 years, we have a number of initiatives and calls for proposals for looking at further development of pandemic preparedness through from vaccines all the way through to manufacturing. And this here just shows you CEPI's vaccine portfolio with our 5 priority pathogens, one of which included MERS, development of rapid response platforms, and obviously development of COVID-19 vaccines. And really the combination of rapid response platforms and working on MERS allowed us to hit the ground running in terms of really thinking of rapidly developing vaccines against COVID-19. We work through partnerships, and this just shows you that CEPI has really a number of different partnerships with industry, with academics, etc., with over 70 partnerships globally. And you can see we're really distributed around the continents of the world in terms of our partners, which are really needed in the context of developing vaccines. But importantly, as we know now with COVID-19, thinking about much more globally distributed manufacturing. With this in mind, so now CEPI really looks at this with an end-to-end approach in terms of enabling equitable access to vaccines. So we're really working from the beginning to priority setting and pre-competitive R&D through to development and licensure, and then manufacturing and delivery, either through CEPI's direct funding or coordination and support, or through our partnerships that we have in the end-to-end spectrum of activities. And this is really all to ensure that ultimately we can get to equitable access as quickly as possible. One piece to highlight, obviously, is COVAX, so working with WHO, Gavi, UNICEF on the end-to-end approach to equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, where we have delivered so far more than 1.3 billion doses of vaccines against COVID-19. So how did CEPI respond to COVID-19 specifically in terms of vaccine development? So this next slide shows you the COVID-19 portfolio, as well as broadly protective SARS-CoV-2 vaccines and broadly protective beta coronavirus vaccines. You can see here we have a large portfolio of vaccines, what we call Wave 1 vaccines, so ones that would deliver doses to COVAX in the 2021 to 2022 timeframe, with 3 of these vaccines now being WHO EUL'd, Oxford AstraZeneca, Novavax and Moderna, and in addition a BioE vaccine with emergency use authorization in India. We're also developing a number of next generation vaccines that will offer some differentiation over those first generation vaccines. And as we were moving into 2021, we were seeing the emergence of variants, starting to look at partnering with organizations who could develop more broadly protective coronavirus approaches. So broadly protective SARS-CoV-2, and we have already announced 4 partnership agreements in relation to, if you like, variant-proof vaccines, including BioNet Asia, working on one approach with a strong emphasis and working in Thailand, and also looking at broadly protective beta coronaviruses. So not just SARS-CoV-2, but other beta coronaviruses. And as we all know, there have already in the 21st century been 3 coronavirus outbreaks or pandemics with SARS, MERS, now SARS-CoV-2. So a real threat for the future. So looking at developing a more broadly protective approach. As well as vaccine development per se, it is really very important to harmonize the assessment of COVID-19 vaccines. And a lot of work that we have been doing in partnership has been setting up a good standards reference material and standard assays that the vaccine community can use. So as an example, developing antibody standards with NIBSC and WHO, a network of laboratories using standard assays, which is available to all developers. And we have now worked with over 35 developers offering the assays free of charge for evaluation. So really important to have the harmonization there so that we can really look at how vaccines perform across the the development life cycle. Another important point is developing preclinical models. And again, looking at CEPI developing a network of preclinical models, really focusing on the BSL-3 and BSL-4 lab pathogens, including SARS-CoV-2, and paying attention to the NC3Rs and guidelines for animal welfare and ethics, and high quality research that is fit for purpose for regulatory evaluations and approvals. Another key element of SARS-CoV-2 has been the development of activities around tracking SARS-CoV-2 variants. So we know that novel variants are arising. We have a project called Agility, which works with GISAID, NIBSC, and the Health Security Agency in the UK to test newly emerging variants in immunological assays and preclinical models to evaluate the impact of the variants on the vaccines that are being used or vaccines that are being developed. Also funding clinical trials, including several studies on variants, and as mentioned before, looking at variant-proof vaccines. So with that in mind, we're looking forward now in terms of what do we need to continue to do to be better prepared for pandemics in the future. We don't know where the next pandemic threat will emerge or when, but we do know that it will happen, and now is really the time to prepare. So over the next 5 years, CEPI has an ambitious plan, raising $3.5 billion to look at being better prepared for pandemics in the future by developing vaccines and other biologic threats and making sure that they are available to the populations. Our objectives broadly fall across three main areas: one of preparedness through developing vaccines against known epidemic and pandemic threats, really transforming in the future to be better prepared for the threats, and connecting between countries, regional and global activities around pandemic preparedness to best use the funds that are available. With this in mind, we have a 100-day mission looking at how we can get to a vaccine for an emerging infectious disease in 100 days, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in the subsequent slides. So this next slide really shows the essence of why we want to get to a 100-day mission. This shows you the trajectory of the pandemic, and you can see here the tremendous work that was done in terms of vaccine development in COVID-19, with the first vaccine being available at just 326 days after the sequence was made available, which is really record time. Usually it would take at least a decade to get to a vaccine to be used against a new pathogen. But you can see there that the death toll at that point was already extremely high. And there is the situation of what if we could have done that in 100 days. We have worked with the scientific community on understanding what are the levers that could mean that we could work more towards a 100-day ambition. And this has been published in a perspectives piece in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of weeks ago, and I encourage you to read that and look at the notions that have come out of that review in terms of getting to 100 days. So just to give you an idea of what we really aspire to do, 100 days is quite challenging. In that first 100 days, you probably do not know the full extent of what a pandemic will look like. And there are critical factors to consider as to whether or not you want to develop a vaccine in 100 days. Is the human-to-human transmission? What is the severity of the disease? How new is the pathogen? And if a vaccine is available, how how can this be made available under controlled conditions in agreement with regulators. And this next slide then shows you some of the critical factors in relation to getting to the 100 days. And I think the most important thing to say is really it is in the preparedness that you can strive to get to 100 days. What we have found through our interviews with a number of key vaccine developers is that there's already room for improvement over the 326 days that we saw in the pandemic. If you put all of the innovations together, you could probably, without doing things specifically differently, by doing things more efficiently, get to about 250 days. But you also need a paradigm shift in the way that you're working, and it's all in the preparedness that is the critical factor. And there are three key elements that CEPI is looking to fund together with others in relation to preparedness. The first is further developing rapid response platforms such as RNA, bringing those platforms to other viral vaccine candidates, developing other vaccines, building the safety database, building the efficacy database of vaccines on the platform, so you have a wealth of data in advance of the pandemic. Developing virus family vaccine libraries. In this instance, we're talking about taking the virus families that are most likely to cause pandemic threats and developing a number of vaccine prototypes in those families to really fully understand what is the best approach to developing a vaccine for that virus family and gaining information in advance of a pandemic that can then be quickly adapted. The other key area is developing critical reagents, and here ensuring that we can have as many reagents available in advance of a pandemic, and of course making sure that there is good global geographical distribution of manufacturing. So when you do get to a new outbreak, a new epidemic or pandemic, what can you do? So you clearly have to shift from the prototype vaccine into the pathogen-specific vaccine, scale up your manufacturing, and get to a point that you have sufficient data to move into the populations most at need within the 100 days. Subsequent to that, it's not all over at 100 days. 100 days is just the beginning. You need to continue to gather data, expand the populations in which you evaluate the vaccines, to get from first use under emergency use authorization in the 100 days out to full approval, which would come sometime later. But it's really about shifting the paradigm between R&D and license as a more of a continuum as you move forward. With all of these in place, there may be circumstances in which the benefit of delivering a vaccine outweigh the risks of the vaccine, taking into account the lethality of the outbreak specifically. So I hope that gives you a flavour of the sort of activities that are needed moving forward. As an organisation, CEPI is hoping to collaborate and with many organisations in vaccine research, innovation, to make this happen in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Melanie Saville, for the very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. We have learned from Dr. Saville that CEPI was just born in 2017, following Ebola outbreak in West Africa. The organization works with a broad range of partners and governments to develop vaccines against emerging pathogens, to develop rapid response platforms for vaccination and outbreak, and to develop science and technology and standard essential for accelerating vaccine development. CEPI is a key driver of COVID-19 vaccine, essentially leveraging on the knowledge and capacities acquired during pre-COVID period to accelerate COVID-19 vaccine development, resulting in phenomenal speed of vaccine manufacture and rapid vaccine access for a global population, although there remain gaps to be narrowed in terms of equitable access. And in this regard, CEPI is working with COVAX facility as mechanism to drive equitable vaccine access. CEPI has a forward-looking plan for a large portfolio of vaccines against infectious diseases of epidemic and pandemic potential, including the next generation COVID-19 vaccine and vaccine for the mysterious disease X, which could be anything bad, anything challenging that we have to cope with. And a very exciting message from Dr. Saville is that CEPI has initiated an ambitious 100-day mission to push for safe and effective vaccine within 100 days for an epidemic or pandemic threat after the epidemic has been identified, and is also raising funds to operate this ambitious campaign. This goal is against our previous knowledge and experience about vaccine development. So this mission must be driven by an ingenious strategy and super effective management with strong partnerships and sufficient funding support. We are looking forward to the progress and the success of this ambitious mission, as it is very critical to the global health security. And it is very good to learn from Dr. Saville that potential developers and manufacturers of COVID-19 in Thailand, such as Bionet Asia, government pharmaceutical organization, as well as the policy agencies like the National Vaccine Institute, are also partners of CEPI. Dr. Nakorn may be able to make comment on this in the open discussion period. Next, I would like to turn to Dr. Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Dr. Kim graduated in medicine at Yale University School of Medicine. He joined the military, and in 2010, he was appointed Principal Deputy U.S. Military HIV Research Program at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And during this time, while stationed at AFRIMS in Bangkok, he was also working with Thai researchers in the phase 3 clinical trial of HIV vaccine. And this project came up with a very significant outcome that could pave way for further development of HIV vaccine. Again, Dr. Nakorn may be able to comment on this as he took a very important part in this project too. Dr. Kim has joined the International Vaccine Institute since 2015 as Director General of the Institute. In the meantime, he has been holding the position of Adjunct Professor at the Graduate School of Public Health, Seoul National University, where IVI is located. He is also an Adjunct Professor of Medicine, Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in the United States. Now let's welcome Dr. Jerome Kim Jerome, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saville, and thank you very much to Dr. Nakon and the National Vaccine Institute for this invitation to speak today on the role of an international organization in emerging infectious diseases, including COVID-19. No. Let's see. Next. Okay. IVI is a UN-chartered international organization, which means that we have member countries. Our mission, which has been our mission for the past 25 years, is to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health under a vision of seeing developing countries free from suffering from infectious diseases. IVI is located in Seoul. It was actually the first international organization to be headquartered in South Korea. We have 199 employees. We work in over 28 countries around the world. The Board of Trustees of IVI recently approved a new version of our strategic plan. You can see the vision and the mission of IVI, which have remained the same. The things that allow IVI to succeed, innovative capabilities, collaborative partnerships, and flexible operations, really inform the pillars of IVI, which are our primary activities. An activity somewhat similar to a research institute that does laboratory research and develops new antigens for testing in humans. A product development pillar, which includes not only vaccine development, but very importantly, epidemiology and burden assessments and vaccine effectiveness evaluations. And finally, the foundation of IVI is an international organization. You can see then the strategic initiatives. First, amplify the core. This is something that IVI needs to do in order to continue to be successful. That is, continue to develop and deliver vaccines for global health. The second is to improve IVI's global footprint, not in the sense that we need to work in many more than 28 countries around the world, but in fact to become a truly international organization. And with regard to that, IVI hopes to open its first regional office in Sweden this year. And finally, to improve the governance of IVI. Again, IVI was founded by scientists like myself, and we're not diplomats. So it's very difficult sometimes for us to conceive of what an international organization does or how it should be organized. So one of the things the board undertook this year is a commitment to create a global council of member states that will advise and inform the board of trustees and the leadership of IVI to create a much more responsive and much more relevant international organization devoted to developing vaccines for global health. This is an illustration of the different member countries. Actually, we just added a 37th member country. The final paperwork from the United Arab Emirates was transmitted to the Secretary General's office 2 weeks ago. So 37 member countries now. These are the places around the world where IVI works. They're somewhat color-coded by program, but now with the explosion of COVID research and other research programs at IVI, many of the colors would be overlapping. You can see typhoid and cholera programs, and then others which include antimicrobial resistance research, chikungunya vaccine development, and also COVID vaccine development. People often ask how IVI differs from the other international organizations involved in global health. Well, you can see us there in the middle. We actually do vaccine development. We actually develop vaccines in our laboratory. We test them in animals. We test them in humans. We help companies with technology transfer of vaccines. We take vaccines to the World Health Organization for qualification. So we differ then from a funder. IVI receives funding from the organizations listed on the left here, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, CEPI, and others. We work with the WHO in order to strengthen and improve WHO policies and to work on WHO committees to get vaccines for global health approved. We also work with organizations like Gavi and UNICEF, which purchase some of the vaccines and distribute the vaccines that IVI has developed. So we are different from these global health organizations in a very critical way in that we are the only international organization that has as a mission to develop and deliver vaccines for global health. On a day-to-day basis, the 199 people who work at IVI do all of these things, and you can see them listed by discover, develop, and deliver, and then epidemiology and surveillance. We do a lot of things. In fact, we function a little bit like a biotech company in that we take a vaccine, we test it, we hopefully get it manufactured by a big manufacturer, we get it approved by World Health Organization, and then we make sure that that vaccine is utilized. Which vaccines? You can see them listed here on the bottom. Under discover are things that are still in the laboratory. Under development are things that are in human clinical testing. Under delivery are vaccines that are approved and are currently being rolled out with a generation of real world evidence that hopefully will inform policy and then some of our epidemiology and surveillance activities. With regard to emerging infectious diseases, IVI works on SFTS, severe fever and thrombocytopenia syndrome, hantavirus, MERS, COVID-19, chikungunya, and an unusual one which is found primarily in Northeast Asia called human adenovirus type 55, which causes a severe pneumonia and death in actually very young children and also in situations where there is crowding, such as in military recruit camps. So this is what IVI does in a bigger picture. You can see impact really drives what we do and how we think. And the impact of vaccines and vaccination really are life saved, decreased disability associated life years, healthier families, and improved economic growth. But in order to get there, we start with new vaccines, either developed at IVI or by a developing country vaccine manufacturer. We work with the manufacturer then on improving or scaling up the manufacturing, on clinical development, on seeking regulatory authority approval and WHO pre-qualification. This increases the supply of a vaccine, but at the same time, the thing that distinguishes vaccines for global health or vaccines for low and middle income countries from, for instance, COVID-19 vaccines is that it isn't always clear that there is a demand for it. Do countries know that they have a problem with cholera, with typhoid, with non-typhoidal salmonella infections that in the aggregate kill between 70 and 600,000 people a year, primarily children under 5? No. And so IVI works with organizations that recommend the use of vaccines, works to develop the information that would allow a Ministry of Health to tell a Ministry of Finance this vaccine would be cost effective if deployed within our system. And we also work with national immunization technical advisory groups that actually implement vaccination in countries around the world. At the same time, we work with organizations like COICA, CIDA, DFID, USAID to deliver vaccines. But with IVI, it isn't just about delivering vaccines, it's to generate real world evidence from these vaccination programs that will further inform or refine policies. So you can see how IVI works throughout the vaccine value chain for impact. And this is an example. And these are actual vaccines that IVI has developed. First, the oral cholera vaccine. When you hear about oral cholera vaccine being used around the world in an outbreak, for instance, in Yemen or elsewhere, it's probably the IVI vaccine. It cost the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation $28 million to move this vaccine from a laboratory at IVI through 3 pre-qualifications and actually 2 additional tech transfers into companies and or countries that aren't intending to seek WHO pre-qualification. The second vaccine is a typhoid conjugate vaccine. The estimated cost to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually is $29 million. So we're going to return $4 million to the Gates Foundation unspent. 2 pre-qualifications will hopefully come from this. SK Bioscience and Biopharma have both filed their dossiers for marketing authorization with the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea and with BPOM in Indonesia. Vaccine number 3 is one that we're still working on. It's still at the animal testing stage, and they're actually now both funded by the Wellcome Trust. Both the Shigella and the non-typhoidal salmonella vaccines are funded by the Wellcome Trust. SK Bioscience is now a contract manufacturer of that vaccine. So how does this work? And what you can see here is an example taken from the IVI cholera programs. So we start here with DOMI, diseases of the most impoverished. DOMI really establishes the burden of cholera globally around the world. Then the Gates Foundation, knowing that cholera was a problem, funded CHOVI, the cholera vaccine initiative, which allowed us to develop the vaccines and then accomplish technology transfers to Shanta, U-Biologics, BibCol, and Incepta here, and then also to conduct delivery studies aimed to improve and to get information on the cost of illness and cost effectiveness analyses of the use of these vaccines in Mozambique and Nepal. And then finally, IVI is working to further improve the vaccine, to simplify manufacturing, to increase the number of doses that are manufactured, to lower the cost of manufacturing, and to improve the performance with a cholera conjugate vaccine that makes up for a hole in the coverage of cholera vaccine. We know that the oral vaccines don't work particularly well in the under 5 population. Hopefully a cholera conjugate vaccine could help us achieve better coverage of that very critical population. In addition, IVI works with countries, and this is just an example of what IVI has done with Korea, to enhance Korean vaccine manufacturing capability. I think actually Dr. Subhamit, Dr. Nakorn will remember in 2010, Korea was informed, as other countries were, that because of the pandemic influenza outbreak, the United States companies based in the United States may not necessarily deliver vaccine that had been contracted for by different countries because of what we call vaccine nationalism. So Korea was very shocked by that. And as a result, initiated a series of discussions around something called Vaccine 3.0, which IVI was a critical part of, which really had in mind to make Korea the number 5 vaccine manufacturing country in the world. At that point, it was number 11, and to be 80% self-sufficient in vaccines. Again, learning from pandemic influenza. I can remember when this was presented to our board of trustees, they said, oh, Korea, really, number 5? How are they going to do that? Well, by 2016, that was funded, $250 million to build 2 pilot plants, one for viral vaccines, one for bacterial vaccines, and a vaccine research center attached to the KNIH. And then in 2018, IVI worked with the Gates Foundation, the Korean government, and a number of manufacturers to create the RIGHT Fund, which is 50% supported by the government, 25% by Gates, 25% by the companies to develop vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics specifically for global health. And then in 2020, a $200 million 7-year effort to develop research and development around key vaccine platforms, to train people to work in vaccine manufacturing, and also to build the intellectual infrastructure necessary in order to sustain a cutting edge vaccine research effort. And of course, IVI is one of the principal partners in Vital Korea. And finally, and again, this is the K Vaccine Initiative passed in December of last year, $2 billion to build the number 5 vaccine manufacturing industry in the world by providing support for industry, support for expansion of manufacturing, and support for training. And IVI's role in K Vaccine is actually to do training for biomedical manufacturing. And actually that has now been recognized in an agreement with WHO to be a part of the WHO Global Training Hub for biomanufacturing. So again, IVI has been working with the Korean government and now with WHO and a number of Korean partners to create value and enhance vaccine manufacturing capacity within the country. This is the K Vaccine Training Program. It's a primary funder is the Ministry of Health in Korea. You can see the different activities. This is exactly what was proposed to the World Health Organization as a part of the training for biomedical manufacturing that was approved, or actually was announced 2 weeks ago. You can see the budget. So the Korean government has agreed to support up to 300 international students in place in Korea to do the training. They can be, and we haven't figured out with WHO yet quite how the people get recommended for the course or who gets selected, whether they come from countries or from companies. But there is a commitment to house and train them in Korea. So that effort should start later this year, and we hope to have the first 2 classes, an online course and a face-to-face introductory course this year. These are our major partners, and that now includes the NBI of Thailand. This is how we've worked in COVID-19. Helping any company, IVI does not have its own vaccine. We've worked with groups to develop international standards, to do animal testing and challenge studies using different vaccine candidates. We've done clinical development of phase 1 to phase 3. We are now doing phase 4 and effectiveness trials. All in all, we don't have our own vaccine. But the companies that we're working with in phase 2B and phase 3 clinical trials of COVID-19 vaccines have committed 1.2 billion doses to COVAX. And so we view our commitment to global health and our commitment to COVID-19 vaccine development as supplying COVAX with doses that are needed all over the world to prevent COVID-19 complications. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jerome Kim, for the very nice and educational talk. I don't think I should try to make any summary of your presentation, as it is so rich and so clear. I just wanted to take this opportunity to inform you that many of our Thai colleagues are very happy to see you at this time. And we had a very good experience working with you previously while you are working in Thailand for a period of time. And I believe, as I heard from NBI from time to time, that NBI has been working with IVI currently on several capacity building activities, and Dr. Nakon may be able to elaborate more on this. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Now we have some more time for open discussion. We have about 20 minutes. And in this model of virtual meeting, sitting alone in front of the camera, I feel a bit lonely. So I invited Dr. Nakon to join me. Let me introduce Dr. Nakon once again. Dr. Nakon is now the director of the National Vaccine Institute of Thailand. He is actually the host of this meeting, of this conference. So thank you very much for joining me. I have collected, with the help of our secretariat, a number of questions, not many. I would like to post them. I will raise some. The first one is probably for Jerome. This is about IVI. You have explained for us the role of IVI and the main activities IVI is working on for the moment, which is very interesting. But the question is probably reflecting on the principle for which IVI is established. The question is, in Thai, IVI มีบทบาทต่อประชาคมโลกอย่างไรคะ? In English, what is the role of IVI to the global community? Probably you may help us highlight about the principle and expectation of IVI for us again.
Yes, thank you for that really important question. And so I think that it's really important to recognize that the diseases CEPI works on are outbreak diseases. And thank goodness that CEPI was here when COVID occurred, because this is the outbreak that everyone had been talking about for a century, and it's happened. And CEPI was instrumental in helping to bring forth very rapid vaccine development. IVI works on what we call, though, unincentivized vaccines. So we can help during COVID, and our help during COVID was really to address the access and equity issues that we knew would exist because they exist for other vaccines that are developed in high-income countries. Eventually, the vaccines trickle down and appear in low-income countries. And I use as an example all the time the rotavirus vaccine, which was approved by the US FDA in 2006, approved by WHO in 2009, recommended by WHO in 2009, and now in 2022, 60% of the world's children do still not receive rotavirus vaccine. So our role in the case of vaccines developed in high-income countries is to ensure equity in access to vaccines. But there are many vaccines, probably infectious diseases that kill between 4 and 5 million people a year, where there isn't a big company involved in research and development. And you would include in that, an HIV vaccine, the vaccines against malaria, or vaccines against diseases many people have never heard of, diseases like leptospirosis or group A streptococcus, which kills 500,000 people a year. No one works on those vaccines. Why? Because no company in a high-income country is interested in developing them. And that's where IVI comes in. No company was interested in making an oral cholera vaccine. The big Western companies were not interested in typhoid conjugate vaccines that would be able to address some of the shortfalls in the oral typhoid vaccine and in the VI, the polysaccharide typhoid vaccines. But typhoid kills 200 to 300,000 people around the world annually. And IVI, hopefully, through its development of vaccines for global health, will be able to fill the gap, to move to vaccine manufacturers that will secure WHO pre-qualification, to work with organizations that will help us to demonstrate that the burden exists in countries, and then to really be able to demonstrate that the vaccines that IVI has developed actually have impact and decrease the burden of disease. So the current target now for cholera is to have a 90% reduction in global mortality from cholera by 90%, or so reduction by 90% by 2030. And that's all possible because we now have an oral cholera vaccine. So we're a little different from CEPI in that we work on endemic diseases of high burden. And we are a little different from CEPI because we have to work throughout the chain, stimulating not only the supply, but the demand for vaccination.
Much. I remember in the early phase of IVI, IVI worked on several endemic diseases that are vaccine preventable, such as, beside cholera, IVI also promoted the work on typhoid vaccine, and also Japanese encephalitis, and also hepatitis B, working for driving the whole cycle from recognition of the problem, from policy development, policy advocacy, to R&D, to vaccine manufacture, to vaccine deployment. That is very helpful. Just my recollection of our previous experience with IVI. Thank you very much. The second question, I would like to put this to Dr. Nakorn.
Yes, please.
And I'll expand the question a little bit. The question is, how does NVI work in connection with international organization in this field? I would like to link a little more to the presentation of Dr.Jos Vandelaer. IVI is working, NVI is also working under the so-called blueprint. And Dr. Vandelaer explained for us about the WHO blueprint for R&D to cope with epidemics. I wonder how is the Thai national blueprint related to the global blueprint coordinated by WHO, and how NVI is planning to move forward the work on vaccine capacity in Thailand under the global blueprint under WHO collaboration. A bit complicated.
Yes.
So Dr. Nakorn, please.
Thank you very much for the important question, and then thank you very much, Dr. Jerome Kim, for joining us this morning on the plenary session of the National Vaccine Conference. This is the picture of the long-term collaboration between NVI and IVI, and as well as the global partners like the WHO and CEPI. So I can address the question in three parts. Number one is the kind of linkage of NVI with the global partner that we have the existing connection and collaboration with WHO and CEPI and IVI before the COVID-19 pandemic. So by that background of work, we can quickly link when we found when we faced with the pandemic in 2020, in January of 2020. And I can remember that in 2019, I went to IVI in Korea, and I personally met with Dr. Richard Hatchett at the forum which held at Seoul in Korea. And Dr. Jerome Kim kindly invited me and introduced me to Dr. Richard Hatchett by that time, so that we can discuss in person, and then we can start our work with CEPI. And IVI is our long-term collaboration partner that we have been working for several years, and I would say decades that we can work with. We have been working with IVI. Many of projects of vaccine development and the vaccine research that we have done together with IVI. I can mention on the recent one of human papillomavirus vaccine that we have a clinical trial try to identify the effectiveness of single dose of HPV vaccine, and the result is quite favorable. And it's a collaboration of Department of Disease Control, Ministry of Public Health, and IVI. And the result will lead to, we hope that it will lead to the recommendation of a single dose of HPV vaccine for the children. And then we can solve the problem of shortage of the vaccine in the global picture. So that one of the example that we have been working so far, and for the linkage of IVI and NVI, right now we have the definitive agreement together, and majorly aiming for the human resource capacity development, and as well as a collaboration on the research and clinical trial as well. So this is a kind of the way that we can work more together, even with or without COVID-19. I mean that we will work together in the vaccine development field. And I think I need to commend and recognize the effort of IVI on the development of neglected tropical disease vaccine, which is very important for a developing country. And Thailand is, I can say that we are the developing country. We still face with the tropical disease, like Dr. Jerome Kim mentioned. Cholera vaccine, we have from time to time the outbreak of cholera and typhoid. Yeah, for cholera right now, even it's not happened in Thailand for many years, but it still be in risk for typhoid or Shigella or non-typhoid. There still be the public health problem and we can call it a neglected tropical disease in some way. And this is a very impressive of work that IVI is working for the developing world. And again, I think we can work together on this part. And for the linkage of the R&D blueprint of WHO and the blueprint of COVID-19 vaccine access of Thailand, it's a little bit different, even it's called the same name of blueprint, because the blueprint of the WHO focus on the R&D of the whole aspect of the emerging infectious disease and including the disease X. And in the various aspects like the virology, surveillance, laboratory, diagnostic, and also vaccine. But for Thailand, the blueprint is for only vaccine access. Again, the R&D part of Thailand blueprint can be counted as a subset under the R&D blueprint of the WHO. But our aim for the blueprint in Thailand is for vaccine access during the COVID-19 vaccine pandemic period. So I can stop here, and maybe Dr. Jerome Kim, you may adding more on our collaboration between NVI and IVI, please.
Dr. Kim, please.
Thanks, Dr. Nakorn, Dr. Saville. So IVI and NVI are hoping to have a joint program so that we can exchange officers for training at IVI. We also actually, and Dr. Nakorn didn't mention the other activities, a phase 3 trial of a chikungunya vaccine being conducted by the Faculty of Tropical Medicine, and then additional work on COVID vaccines, including working with Dr. Pani Pitisudutum, not as a sponsor, but as a backup. And we look on this as very important work, working with Thailand to strengthen capacity, but also to work on diseases like chikungunya, where there may be a particular interest among the Thai people and in the Thai government. I think that there is a lot to. And I'm sorry. In the last part, and probably the one of the most interesting things for me personally is we have a grant from CEPI to work with Bionet Asia on an RNA-based vaccine, and I think that work is very exciting. So, and it's a long-term commitment. I think Dr. Nakorn remembers the first discussions we had with Bionet now probably over 10 years ago around an HIV vaccine. And I'm glad to see that CEPI has funded that activity. But I think Thailand has a lot to offer. In terms, I remember that Thailand taught our African investigators how to do HIV vaccine research. There was a large meeting, and the ministry allowed the collaborators through the program to see how a phase 3 trial was conducted in Thailand. And that was very important. So, Thailand has a lot to add. And we're hoping that, with this training activity and with the new bilateral relationship between IVI and NVI, that we will have an opportunity to strengthen each other, to have people work at IVI, to have IVI staff working with NVI, because there are certain things that the Thai government does, for instance, in health economics, that would greatly inform some of our other efforts as we move not only in low-income countries, but in countries that are beyond that stage and are able and have very robust healthcare systems. Because increasingly, universal health insurance will be something, and it changes the equation that ministries of health need to do to justify funding for different vaccines or preventive measures. So, Dr. Nakorn, Dr. Saville, we're really looking forward to a broader relationship and maybe some more active participation of Thailand in the governance of IVI.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. I observe that we still have some more minutes left. I'd like to strike a balance. Unfortunately, Dr. Vandelaer and Dr. Saville couldn't be joining us in the discussion, but I wanted to raise a question in relation to Dr. Saville's presentation, and may again ask Dr. Kim to give some idea. I'm still excited with Dr. Saville's message on the 100-day mission that is to drive the development of a vaccine against epidemic or even pandemic within 10 days.
100 days.
The epidemic is identified. To me, this sounds very, very ambitious. It's not just like making instant noodle or making a modular home. In those cases, for instant noodle, we have already have a half-processed noodle in place. And for the modular home, there are prefabricated pieces that we can put together within, say, 100 days. But this is the vaccine, very sophisticated, biological, with a lot of process and uncertainties involved. I wonder how this ambitious goal could be achieved. But from her presentation, I've learned that the preparatory period, the preparedness to have something in place before the outbreak really happened is very important, and this can take as long as possible. So the question to you, as I believe IVI is also a partner to this ambitious campaign, what kind of preparation should be taken or made within that pre-operation period? We may learn a bit from you. What kind of research or capacity building, or what kind of management or partnership raising must be done before that start of the 100 days?
Yes, thank you. That's a very, very important question because, in theory, things work really well, but in practicality, sometimes we fall short. So I think one of the things to remember is how did we go from a 10-year cycle to an 11-month cycle for development of a vaccine? And they did that largely by telescoping, by moving phases to a state where they no longer were one after the other, but were overlapping. So you could see the companies starting phase 2 after the first several doses of phase 1 were complete, after they've determined the vaccine was safe and was immunogenic, making the correct immune responses. They moved on to phase 2, and they started phase 3 before phase 2 was actually, finally complete at the end of 12 months of follow-up or 18 months of follow-up. So there was a lot of compression or overlapping of phases. At the same time, and this is the key to acceleration, that you need to actually do things in parallel, and that included the regulatory submissions. So it meant having, and again, I think we could work on making this faster and more efficient, approval for certain platforms to be modified. So you would take an mRNA backbone and you would insert a different set of genes for the new pathogen. And now the backbone itself has already been approved. It's been in the case of the RNAs, in billions of people. And we know what the issues are. We know how safe they are. So the regulatory agency allows certain things to move faster than normal. For instance, you might be able to skip the non-human primate phase, or they may accept immunogenicity in animals as the trial was beginning. So there are several things that can be done, but a lot of it will depend on whether regulatory agencies and ethical review bodies and platforms have been reviewed in advance, and that we are comfortable with their safety, and the fact that the new immunogen, the new vaccine, can be tested without risking without risk to the human volunteers. The final part of this is, and I think people sometimes don't think about this as much, but remember that CEPI and Operation Warp Speed provided a huge amount of money to decrease the risk of the companies that were involved. Now, I mean, Pfizer may be the only major company that currently has an approved vaccine. The others, like Johnson & Johnson, have very relatively small vaccine efforts, or like Moderna didn't have a vaccine or at all. And so what they did was the governments said, here's a certain amount of funding. If in the end you achieve what we need, then we will buy your vaccine. And that actually allows companies to accelerate the pace of development. And I think, sometimes we don't remember that CEPI put $1.5 billion, the US government put $12 billion to move vaccines along very quickly. And so, CEPI will have increased funding, but even the CEPI funding was small by comparison to what other governments contributed to develop vaccine. So telescoping, working out the regulatory and ethical issues, working with, again, the regulatory bodies to have a very clearly defined pathway for expedited review. And then understanding that, there are certain things that have to be done in order to make sure that you'll have companies that are willing to commit resources, time, and effort into developing vaccines that we may need 100,000 doses of, or that we may need 10 billion doses of. And so again, this gets to a little bit of what Dr. Saville was talking about when she talked about the different modes of transmission and how that potentially might impact what kind of vaccine needed to be developed and the timeline for development.
Thank you very much. That's very thought-provoking and very educational. So the regulatory authorities have to be on board since the start of this process, or the whole process. That's very important. I think we have to come to the conclusion of this meeting. On behalf of the organizer, the National Vaccine Institute, I would like to thank our speakers, Dr.Jos Vandelaer, Dr.Melanie Saville, and Dr.Jerome Kim for your contribution of valuable time and for sharing of very, very interesting, very educational messages, knowledge, and very importantly, inspiration. I believe what we have shared here and also shared in the discussion will be very important, will be very valuable, and will make a future impact on our work, and especially for the work on vaccine capacity in Thailand under the coordination of the National Vaccine Institute and working with all partnerships in the country and with international partnerships like IVI, CEPI, WHO, and many other partners. I would like to thank you all, and I also thank Dr. Nakorn for joining me on this session, and thank all the participants for your attention. Again, thank you very much. I call this meeting, this session to a close, and now I turn to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you. ครับ
On behalf of NVI and the conference management team, I would like to sincerely thank Dr. Supamichun Sutiwat and Dr. Nakorn Premsi, as well as all the honorable speakers for their insightful presentations at the conference. This will allow us to expand our knowledge on global preparedness towards pandemic. We certainly gained quite important information from your perspective. And thank you for your participation during this plenary. ในนามของสถาบันวัคซีนแห่งชาติขอขอบพระคุณวิทยากรทุกท่านเป็นอย่างสูงดิฉันหวังว่าผู้รับชมทุกท่านจะได้รับความรู้และข้อมูลที่เป็นประโยชน์จากการบรรยายในวันนี้ค่ะและขอประชาสัมพันธ์เพิ่มเติมในการประชุมวิชากรวัคซีนแห่งชาติครั้งนี้เรามีนิทรรศการออนไลน์สามารถรับชมได้ที่เว็บไซต์ webconf10-exhibition.com และขอความกรุณาทุกท่าน ร่วมทำแบบประเมินความพึงพอใจต่อการประชุมวิชาการวัคซีนแห่งชาติครั้งนี้ โดยสามารถสแกน QR Code ที่ปรากฏหรือคลิกลิงก์ด้านล่างนี้ได้เลยค่ะ สุดท้ายนี้ขอเรียนเชิญทุกท่านรับชมคลิปวิดีโอจากสถาบันวัคซีนแห่งชาติและพบกันใหม่ในวันพรุ่งนี้เวลา 9 นาฬิกานะคะ ขอขอบคุณทุกท่านที่ติดตามรับชมมาตลอด สวัสดีค่ะ